likes to eat. He could go all night, but he likes.
Brother, we watched the World Cup. Unfortunately, my oldest brother is very expressive, and people score goals, and Zephyr cried 3 times because of the goal.
Yeah.
Messi, stop scoring. Anyway, it was good though. Hi, Tool.
Sorry, 1 second.
You're muted.
Yeah, you're muted.
Hi.
Hi. We were just waiting. We thought that Jamie Arnett was gonna join us, but she's not here yet. So let's just give it 1 more minute. Oh, where did everybody?
Sorry, I'm trying to get this. We were hooked up with video a second ago, and now we're not. So
That's okay.
School's back.
Wonder if Jamie may be challenged with her animals because of the weather.
Oh, yeah.
I don't.
She might be.
Do we have any participants from the public on?
yes, there are.
Imagine Dave is one of them. Olson.
Yeah. Can they hear us right now?
They should be able to hear us.
Okay,
Yeah.
we're just,
I
we're
don't know
about
why
to
they
get
lost it.
started. We're just having a few technical difficulties and we'll get started soon if you can hear us.
Yes, we can hear you.
Aaron, can you tell who?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna pop out and rejoin here with this computer because we just lost all our video controls from here. So give me 1 second and then we'll rejoin this.
Okay.
Well, someone just drove up.
Oh.
Oh, there it is. Morning, welcome.
We haven't quite started yet. No, no, absolutely not.
I'm Christine, I haven't met the two of you in person. Oh, you're great, Beaton's national fair. Hi, nice to meet you. Welcome.
Yeah,
yeah, but you're, yeah. I think you'll get things done.
Yeah, we're gonna have a whole series of slide presentations.
Slide this over.
In fact, why don't the two of you just join us here at the table and I'll sit over there. It'll be much more comfortable. You'll be able to see the screen better.
Okay.
You can all speak down a little bit too.
Thank you.
We're used to
Pick the microphone too. Well, just be careful. Anything you say is gonna be recorded.
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, 2 chairs there. You'd be a lot more comfortable in those certain foot hours.
There's a lot of material.
I think we are live here. It has my name highlighted because I think I was the last person to speak.
Okay, great. Well, should we get started then? It is, I don't know what time it is right now. It is 2:07 and we are, I'm calling the special meeting of November 28th, 2022 to order. And the first item on our agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. Please join me. Pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Great, so this is a special meeting to focus on water resources in the Nooksack River Basin. And Steve or Rebecca, do you want to kick this off?
Yeah, thank
Okay,
you.
great.
Thank you very much. Could we hit the first slide, please? What we'd like to do today, we'd look at this as one of 2 parts presentation on water rights, water uses. Today, we're going to focus on several elements of water resource management. And then I think sometime in January, Brian Walters will pick up and talk about how we operate our systems, how our systems work, how our water rights are integrated into our systems, and talk a little bit about the infrastructure. Today, we're going to focus on mainly 3 elements. One is the nature and physics of water, talking about the water cycle. We'll have a few slides on that. I don't think any of that is going to be new to any of you, but it's sort of almost a water 101. And Rebecca will be talking a little bit about water flows in the main stem of the river. We'll talk about fish species that we find throughout all of Whatcom County in the different tributaries and in the main stem. And then we'll talk a little bit about partners in managing resources, mainly focusing on our watershed management board, our watershed management team, and planning unit. And then John is going to take up the whole discussion on water rights, water claims, certificates, legal cases that we've seen in the last few years that could and have impacted how we use our water right, and then talk a little bit about the adjudication process. And then we'll go into what we're calling regional supply and management, and who's doing what in the basin, talking about the municipalities, so the water associations, water districts, the individual exempt permitted wells, and then talk a little just a couple slides on climate change and why should we even be worried about it. So with that, next slide, please. If we look at our public utility districts mission statement that we currently have, this is what it says. Public Utility District number 1 of Whatcom County is a steward of public assets and resources, providing locally controlled utility services and resource protection for the benefit of the community. It's pretty wide and broad in terms of what that says. And I think we'll try to cover as best we can today how we've engaged over the last almost 20 some years now with that focus in mind. Next slide, please. We see these as our 2 top priorities in terms of the PUD's priorities in terms of water resource management. Number 1 is to protect and manage. What does that mean? Protect and manage the water, PUD's water rights to support the most efficient use of those rights by current customers and to the benefit of all water needs in the Nooksack River Basin. That second part of that tends to be a little bit fuzzy in terms of how far do we reach? How actively do we get engaged in watershed management, water resource planning in the community? Number 2, actively engage in activities. Engage in water resource planning activities to integrate water supply in support of county-wide natural resource plans and projects that bring ecological systems value to agriculture, industrial, municipal, and stream flow for fish and habitat. Again, we've talked about this in the past, but there's always this question of should we stay actively involved in watershed management board, watershed management team, planning unit, the broader question of how active do we stay in assisting others to implement actions that are developed under the Watershed Management Board. Next slide. So today we're going to talk about the nature and physics of water, talk a little bit about the hydrology of how water works in the basin. John will cover laws and governing water. And then we'll talk about water associations, water districts, municipalities, and ourselves in terms of how water service is really organized in the county and how it's managed today. Next slide. We looked, you can find different examples of what is called a water cycle. Rebecca found this in the next few slides. These are all USGS, United States Geological Survey slides on water, on talking about the water cycle and how it works. We decided that this was probably the best example of the water cycle, because if you look at it, there's a couple of words in there that I was actually had to sit down and look up the definition of. Sublimation is one of them. But if you look at this slide, I think it best represents Whatcom County because it really covers all different aspects of the water cycle. And the old adage about water always flows downhill. Well, it does flow downhill, but as we look at this, if we start off on the right side of that slide and look at water storage in oceans, and then we look up at evaporation and condensation, and then storage of water in ice and snow, glaciers, snow. Then we look at how water then does flow downhill and different aspects of surface runoff, snow melt into streams, evaporation out of lakes and surface water storage, groundwater discharge, groundwater storage and discharge eventually back into the ocean. I think this is probably a slide that you could almost say was made up for Whatcom County because it really covers every aspect of the water cycle. If we look at the left side of that slide, and we look at groundwater discharge, groundwater storage, springs, freshwater storage, evaporation. Here again, if you think about North County especially, where most of our agriculture is crops and agricultural crops and dairy are located. That's where you really get into the interaction between groundwater and surface water. And as we know, as we've looked at different studies that have been completed and a couple of studies that are just going to be getting kicked off in the beginning of 2023, we are starting to try to get a better understanding of the interaction between groundwater and surface water, how much water is actually stored in subsurface, underground. We don't know a lot of even what we don't know at this point, but we are working pretty dramatically, I think, not fast enough for some, but trying to figure out that interaction and what it means in terms of the highs and lows in stream flow, and then how many wells we have in the county and what the interaction is between them. I forgot to mention, if anybody's got any questions as we move along, please jump in, because especially these first sets of slides are pretty much, here they are, we can talk about it. And next slide, please. I'll just going through a few terms that we saw on that previous slide. Evaporation is the process by which water changes from liquid to a gas. Rate of evaporation depends on how dry the air is and the temperature difference between air and water. And that's just an example that they had on their slides, USGS of water evaporating from hot springs. Of course, during the different times of the year, depending on the temperature, air temperature, depending on how much water we've got in our shallower aquifers, we see a lot of evaporation taking place. Next slide. Transpiration, precipitation, evaporation. If you think about how much cropland that we have in Whatcom County and how much during certain times of the year, we have very, very little precipitation. And even with such great advances in types of irrigation, going from drip irrigation, under surface drip irrigation, we still experience a significant amount of evaporation and loss of water from our shallower aquifers. And as the slide says, evaporation and transpiration are often combined into a single term called evapotranspiration. And if you think of how many thousands of acres of corn, berries, potatoes that we have in the county, during certain, 3 to 4 months of the year, we can lose a lot of subsurface storage to the air. Next slide, please. Condensation is the process by which water vapor in the air is changed into liquid water. As air rises, it cools. Cold air holds less water than warm air, and thus, as the air cools, clouds form. And we can certainly see then an opportunity for precipitation if that all combines into a current situation. Next slide. Precipitation is water released from the clouds in the form of rain, freezing rain, sleet, snow, or hail. It happens when clouds can no longer hold water. The water then falls to the earth because of gravity. I thought this was an interesting slide. They were the only one that we could find that said, talked about thunderstorms, but I actually didn't know this, that thunderstorms form when air is forced upward at a very fast rate and therefore cools very quickly. And so then you get the precipitation, and it happens very quickly. Next slide, please. This is one that really connects, or did connect me to Whatcom County, because of the variation in our geological makeup in the Nooksack Basin. Significant differences from different areas of the county in terms of the makeup of our subsurface soils. And infiltration is the process by which water soaks into the ground. Water infiltrates much faster and deeper into a sand than compared to a clay. We all probably know that, but infiltration is faster on dry soils and in sandy soils compared to wet and clay soils. This is because the pore space in sand is much larger in clay and can therefore transport more water. If you look back at a couple of the water associations that have drilled wells over the years, and what they found in terms of the layers of sand and then hitting, and I always like to call it hard pan, but a level of where the water is not going to be transported below that. And then other parts of the county where you have wells that are drilled and you have 300 to 400, some cases 700, 800 feet of clear sand and very porous soil, and then you hit bedrock. And so if you can drill through that bedrock, and if you can find water, then you're looking at a much more dependable storage area of water. Not saying that water is going to be there for, go ahead, Mike.
Oh, I was going to ask you if you know or are aware of any studies being done in Whatcom County to determine the areas that have good or poor infiltration.
I can tell you that there has, as far as I know, there has not been a Nooksack Basin wide studies to look at this area versus that area versus this area, that we can say that, yes, we have a pretty good snapshot of what the geology looks like throughout the county. But I know that, for example, Delta Water Association has drilled about, I think, 3 different wells going down to about 250 feet, never hit bedrock. They have a nitrate problem. They have a water supply problem in terms of their water rights. That's why they were doing those test wells. What they were finding is that they were still staying in that Abbotsford Sumas aquifer, that fairly shallow aquifer. Now, Birch Bay Water and Sewer District in Blaine drilled, I think, a total of 3 wells south and east of, well, north and east of Custer and between Custer and Blaine. And 2 of those 3 wells, they were able to get down to around 700 feet and find good quality water after drilling through hard rock, where the surface water was not going to be infiltrating into those wells. City of Ferndale has drilled, I think, 3 new wells over the last 10 years near their public works department building north and, well, near the old library up in that area. And there's different opinions as to how those wells may be impacting shallower individual water association wells. So it's a long answer. I think that there's been some well drilling in the North Fork of the river. And I think that there was at least one test case that was a well was drilled near Acme. But to say that we've done a number of studies that we can say, here's what the geology of the entire basin looks like. No.
Because my question would be based around, then we have probably a lot of natural storage areas in Whatcom County. When I think of such things as sandy soil, because it could hold water. Compared to the clay would actually force it to run off more and go somewhere else. So we wouldn't have as good storage. And people who have wells in those areas probably are the ones who suffer the most with lack of water year round. So I just thought we may have natural holding tanks and we're probably not even tapping into that idea.
Well, the Ag Water Board and several of the irrigation districts have said for years, that's our best supply, that's our best storage is groundwater. But I think that you have to take a look at the level, you know, the depth of where that source is, where you're getting it from. And then you still don't know enough whether that same Sumas aquifer is 300 feet deep, say east of Linden by a mile, and you go north and west of Linden, it may be only 200 feet deep or 100 feet deep or even shallower. The other area that I forgot to mention was it's been how many years ago that Lummi went through their reservation negotiations and settlement on the west end of the reservation on the groundwater. And what they found there was the issue was that they had private well associations tapping the groundwater, and it was taking water away from some of the wells that the Lummi owned. So they went through an adjudication and a negotiated settlement out there on the west half of the reservation. And what they found was that the level of groundwater was starting to be impacted. I shouldn't say the level, but the quality of the groundwater was starting to be impacted by intrusion by salt water. And as the salt water, as the oceans start rising more and more, you're going to get more push into those groundwater wells. And so even the wells that the Lummies had at the time, they were indicating that they knew that they needed to start to look for different sources of supply. So again, it's a long-winded answer, but yeah.
No, thank you.
Next slide, please. Surface water runoff is precipitation or melted snow that runs off over the landscape. Runoff occurs when the rate of precipitation or snowmelt is greater than the rate of infiltration. If you read those comments on the side of that, runoff water flows to sewers in some urban areas and usually to surface water to retention basins in other urban areas and usually soaks into the ground. Well, as we've seen over the years, the level of development and covering of soil surfaces in the county, that's a pretty simple statement there. And we know that, for instance, city of Bellingham, city of Ferndale, city of Blaine, city of Linden are actively developing their stormwater management systems, because every house that's built, that water's got to go someplace. It's going to go into those catch basins. The more surfaces that get covered or covered over, whether it's with gravel, whether it's blacktop, homes, roofs, buildings. Just in the case of city of Linden is just considered the approval of another large seafood processing plant in Linden between Linden Door, Americold, Versicold, the new pet plant, and now the storage or the seafood processing plant. In the last 5 years, city of Linden, just in that quadrant between Guide Meridian and Berthisson, will cover pretty close to an additional 1 million square feet of land with building space. Water's got to go someplace, And so you got to develop those stormwater management plans to take that water, clean it up before it gets discharged. Next slide. I think this is a pretty simple, but I think a fairly good example of, we talk about water infiltrating into soil, sort of gets to your question, I think, Mike, in some ways. Soil, different levels of soil and different types of soil will allow water to be stored, or unsaturated soil will allow that water to go down eventually and either discharge through ground back out into streams and into the ocean, or it could be kept as a reservoir. So if we look at that, we see different levels of soil, different avenues for precipitation and runoff to be charged back into the saturated zone or the groundwater storage area on the bottom of the picture. And of course, that's gonna, that level between this, where the trees are and the grass is, that's that surface, and the saturated zone, that is going to change depending on what the geology is going to be. And if we know enough, at least, even though we haven't done a significant number of studies on what that, how deep that unsaturated zone is, we know that it varies tremendously throughout Whatcom County. Interesting when you look at a couple of different streams where we have tributaries, where we have meters or gauges, I should say, and I'll just pick two of them that I'm pretty aware of, Bertrand and Fish Trap. You have Bertrand, there are times of the year where there's no water, literally no water flowing across the border into. But by the time you get to, even during the dry period, you get to where the Bertrand flows into the river and we have water flowing. So we have groundwater that's saturating back through that has been built up during the wet times. Fish Trap is the same situation. Now you get on some other parts of the county and you have just the opposite. You could have water flowing, maybe a minimal amount during July at, I'd call it the headwaters of a tributary. And by the time you get to outflow, say like California Creek, where it outflows into the bay, there's no water. Where's it going? Well, it may be being pulled out by irrigators. It could be simply saturating back, depending on what that groundwater level is. So. Next slide, please. I think this is a good example of very simple, but pretty clear example of what I just said, is that precipitation flows, runs off, could be from glacial melt, could be some snow melt, runs onto the surface, flows into a stream. Some of it's infiltrated into the ground and increases the level of what that says there's a water table. You could have a stream or a lake, a reservoir, a holding area for water that could also be doing the same thing, increasing that water table, that height of that water, to help that well produce the amount of water. Now we know for certain that when City of Ferndale built their last well, or drilled their last well and put it into production, that we started getting calls from private well owners and small water associations south and west of Ferndale saying that their wells were going dry. We had one instance where a small water association had a well that didn't need pumps, was pumping an artesian well for years and years and years. City of Ferndale drilled their well, put it into production, and that well did not produce water or, an artesian lake. And the city of Ferndale ended up buying and placing a pump on that well for that water association. So they're still getting water, but that pressure into that wellhead was dropped significantly, and so that it was not producing it without the pumping. Next slide, please. This is pretty straightforward. Water in lakes, streams, wetlands may come from precipitation, surface water runoff, groundwater discharge, flow to a lake, stream, or the ocean, or infiltrate into the ground. We talked about that. I think Lake Whatcom is probably the best example of when the city of Bellingham did a study several years ago, looking at the need to have continue to use their diversion on the Middle Fork. And what their study indicated at that time was that they felt that based upon the size of the Lake Whatcom runoff basin, the basin from hillside to hillside, they could support their water needs for the city of Bellingham through 7 years of drought without having to call upon using the Middle Fork diversion. I don't know if that still holds true or not today. That was probably about 10 years ago they did that study. So it's a pretty simple statement to say that this, Lake Whatcom is all they need, but we have to look at systems like Bellingham and some of the other municipalities as a system, and it's not just a standalone. We can take water out of the river, or we can take water out of the lake. Next slide, please. Water in oceans comes from precipitation, runoff, groundwater discharge, and streams. May stay there for a long time, but some of it evaporates, obviously, as we looked at that first slide on the water cycle. Next slide, please. Water and ice and snow, including glaciers and ice caps, comes from precipitation. Water in glaciers and ice caps is stored for a long time. I think those last two words are what's important. Long time, it's not indefinite. Just because we had a glacier, on Mount Baker in 1950, and we saw that as a long-term, almost infinite storage opportunity. We've seen, the glaciers in the Cascades depleting dramatically in the last, 50 to 60 years. And so eventually, if climate change continues on its path as is now forecasted, it won't be in our lifetime, but probably in the next 50 to 60 years, we could be without any water storage in our glaciers. One of the things that came out of the climate action plan from the International Climate Action Committee, looking at northern India and southern China, those areas that depend upon the Himalayas for their glacier runoff for water supply, they are now seeing that disappearing by the end of this century. Possibly that even the Himalayas may not have any glaciers left. So long time maybe, but not infinite. Next slide, please. This is one that I think, if you look at 97% of the Earth's water is in the ocean. So the left column says of all the water that we are aware of in the Earth or on the Earth, only 3% of it is considered fresh water. The rest of it is saline ocean water. Of the 3%, now of the 3%, the next column says that 68.7% is in glaciers and ice caps. Groundwater, 30%. This is worldwide. And only 0.9% is considered surface water. So 0.9 of 3% is considered fresh surface water. Now, if we look over at that 3%, I'm sorry, 3%, it's 0.3%. So if you look at the far right column, That leaves us with 3/10 of 3% of the world's water is freshwater, surface water. Of that, only 2% is in rivers. Now, if you look at the flashiness of our river, and you look at the changes in that flow in the main stem and the tributaries because of climate change, even if you are not a proponent of and a believer in climate change, we've had enough experience in the last few years where the flashiness of that river is significant enough that whoever depends upon the main stem of the river and the tributaries for supply, we need to be at least cognizant of how we plan for that in the future. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Can you hear me, Steve? Sorry.
Oh.
Next slide is mine.
Okay,
Oops.
right.
Oops. What happened here? I'm missing a slide. Oops. For some reason, wow.
There we go.
Well, that's not the next slide, but I can show it. Oh, they're backwards. I could show this first. So I'm going to cover a little bit about the Nooksack River just down in Ferndale Gauge area, and then go on to some fish species, and then jump into some habitat. And let me turn on my video too. You can see me now. So I'm going to try something. I'm going to click on this link, and this is the link that, as you can see, is on our website that takes you to the current river conditions. Well, maybe it's not working. Worked for me before. Oh, there we go. There we go. Sorry about that. Now I'm not sure. Can you see the screen?
We still see we're still seeing your slide
Okay.
with the.
Let me see. I might have to stop the share and try this again then. I was told it would work, but it's not. So let me stop the share and see if I can get it to. Oh, Aaron's coming to help me.
Try sliding it over, and I still can't see it.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
we wanted to,
Yeah, so
what Rebecca was going to talk about is just a little bit about.
Okay. Hold on.
There, okay. The flows at the Ferndale Gauge, and just what we monitor and
Okay.
what is monitored and gauged.
Okay, we got it. Just had to, first time I've ever done that on live. So just so you know, this is the screen. This is the screen of the PUD, and you go to the about section there, and it's then the current river conditions, and it'll take you right to this page. And this is the current river conditions at this, as Steve was saying, at the Ferndale Gauge. Just as an FYI, I don't know if these are easy to see, but under the categories, major flood stage is considered at 23 feet, moderate is 20.5 feet, and flood stage is 18, just to give you an idea. And we've reached at least, I don't know if I've ever been here when we've reached 23, but I know we've been at flood stage and at least 20.5 feet. So the first screen is, these are real time. So they change. At the, so right now we're at 2:42, so we're right at the 2 p.m. time. And this blue line, dark blue line, which kind of goes out when I do this, make this a little bit bigger, I guess. This is the actual flow of the river right now. So it's right now, it's at 5.62 feet, and this is what that shows. And this also shows you what the CFS is, which is, I believe, around 4 something right now. I'll show you more detailed screen. So let me get out of this one. And then you can scroll down, and these are more details of the same screen. So this is the discharge in cubic feet. Again, this is on today, November 28th, and it is showing it at about 5,000, a little over 5,000 cubic feet per second. And then you can scroll down.
Rebecca,
Mhm.
I'm just going to jump in here. If you look at the little triangle on the bottom, said the median daily statistic for 56 years. So this is the second oldest continuous, as far as I know, public gauge on the Nooksack. There is one other one in the North Fork that goes back 80 some years, I think 81 or 82 years.
Okay.
But the little triangle shows just for this screen, what it says is that the average daily for the last 56 years was what, 5,800 CFS. This year, I think we had the lowest flow during the summer, the warmest part of the season was right around 600 CFS. Last year, we had one at 480. I think the lowest flow that we've ever recorded at Ferndale was just over 400, 420 or 440. Brian will talk about this when he talks about infrastructure and our diversions. But we probably don't have too much of a concern about our ability to pump water out of the river until you get down to a gauge height of about 2.5 feet. But the gauge height is not necessarily, you can't simply say that the gauge height is this today, here's the flow. And so if the flow goes here, the gauge height is going to go here. It all depends upon what happens with the width of the river and the flow in the river in terms of sediment that builds up on certain parts of the banks and so forth. We did a study a few years ago on the ability for us to pump water, move it through our system. And at Ferndale, that study showed us, I think, it was just a little over 2 feet gauge height that we could still pump and treat water. But that can change. So go ahead.
I'll just move now to the next screen. Is similar to the one above, but this is the gauge height. So it's in the how high the gauge reads that, and it's right now it's a little below 6.5 feet. I think that's what that says. So that those give you kind of this idea, and it's, like I said, you can go on and look at these on a daily basis. The last one is a current river temperature, but there's no temperature gauge on the Ferndale gauge. Steve and I were talking about that. And we don't know if there ever was one or it was on there and they took it off. But this one is, so the current temperature is taken at North Cedarville, which is quite a ways up the river. I can't remember what mile it is, but it's a ways up there. But today it's
just downstream from from Nugent's Corner, the bridge.
That's what I thought. It's close to Deming or Nugent's Corner. So today is, as you can see, there's been quite a drop in it from the beginning of or earlier in November now down to 39 degrees, 40 degrees. And then Steve and I were talking about that, and you might want to speak to that, Steve, how that it can be totally different water temperature down here, or can be slightly different. Just depends on the river conditions. And we usually don't have to worry about frazzle ice until that temperature of the river at Ferndale drops down and stays down for a number of hours, down around that 32 to 33 degrees. And what happens is if we have high winds, consistent high winds, 25 to 30 mile an hour for a extended time, 1 to 2 days, and we have snow, that the whole column of the river just becomes one giant slushy, and you can't suck enough water into our intake screens without them plugging up to keep our system running. And so that's when we put on extra blow-offs on our system and 24 hours personnel coverage. So Okay, that's it. I'll have to stop sharing this and then jump us back into the rest of the PowerPoint. Just take me a second here. Okay. Oops. Oops. Here we go. No, wait a minute. Here we go. Alrighty, so I'm going to down to the next slide, and this next one. All right. Let me try this again.
I think we're going to be talking a little bit about the fish species and then how we are engaged with other partners in the basin, dealing with habitat restoration, and the history of that.
For
That
some
looks
reason,
good. That looks good, Rebecca.
I know, but oh, there it goes. It just wasn't moving forward. Sorry about that. So we wanted to bring up talk about habitat and habitat restoration and what's going on in the Nooksack Basin with that. And we thought it might be nice to step off with some of the major fish species that are in the Water Resource Inventory Area 1, or WIRA 1 as we call it. And of course, many of you are aware of the fact that that is a big issue with all of the restoration work that is going on to try to recover the salmon and bring these fish back up to the populations that will hopefully be higher than they are now. So I just wanted to give you a little bit, just name the fish. I'm not a fish biologist, so I don't know a lot about them in detail, but I have to send out a thank you to Don Thompson. He is a senior planner for Whatcom County. He works in their natural resource department. He also works with the Endangered Species Act. So he's very involved with helping with the recovery, working for county and with the tribes. So the Chinook salmon, the chum, and the coho, also known as called silver, those are all the three major salmon that are in the Nooksack Basin. They're anadromous, which means that they spawn and rear as juveniles in freshwater and then migrate to saltwater to mature. The Chinook is a federally listed under the Endangered Species Act as threatened. There are two native populations of the Chinook in the Nooksack. The North Middle Fork, so the North and Middle Fork have the one population and the South Fork has the other population. I don't know the difference. I'd have to ask John or get more detail from him on that. And then the chum and coho are protected. They're not threatened yet. They're protected. So they're in a little bit better space for being recovered. Steelhead is listed as threatened, and it is the difference between the steelhead and the salmon. The steelhead go to sea to mature, and then they return to spawn over multiple years. So they don't die after spawning like the salmon do. So that's a major difference between the steelhead. And I could let Aaron speak about fish because I know he knows a lot about fish. So pipe up, Aaron, if you have anything to say. Bull trout is also listed as threatened. It is native to this area. It is also, I've never pronounced this correctly, unadromous, which means it migrates to the marine. It spawns in the freshwater. And there's not a picture of the Dolly Varden because they're very similar looking, but the Dolly Varden is also a resident fish of the Nooksack Basin. Sockeye, this one up here in the right-hand corner, they are native. And the unique thing about sockeye is that they rear in the river instead of lakes like most sockeye. So the ones that are native here rear in the river. They don't rear in the lakes. Kokanee, there are landlocked sockeye that are native to Lake Whatcom and have been planted in many other places for sport fisheries. I've never seen a kokanee salmon, but I'm assuming some people that have been in Whatcom County all their life might have seen one. And then the pink salmon, it's interesting, I never knew this, but they typically have a strong return in the Nooksack in odd years. So I don't know how fish figure out odd and even years, but that's the fact that they only come into the Nooksack Basin in odd years. And one of the statements that John told me, or one of the things that John told me, is that they're looking to see if the 2001 floods that we had could impact the return of the pinks in 2023. So they're watching for that to see if there was any impact due to the flooding. And then there's a smaller number of pinks that return every year on the even years. So, or return on the even years. So I thought that was an interesting fact for the pink salmon. So that's the main fish species. I'm happy to try to answer questions, but if I would suggest that if we really wanted to go in some more detail to the fish and how they interact with the river and everything like that, we could bring John Thompson or some other fish biologist and have them do like a nice 20-minute presentation, because they can bring up a lot more detail. So now I'm going to go in and speak a little bit to the partnerships that we have to help do habitat and habitat restoration. Of course, the PUD has been involved in the YR1 watershed management project since 1997. And we become involved as part of that management project with the Puget Sound Partnership, which is providing funding for several of the grants I've managed, but they are working regionally to restore the Puget Sound area. And then Whatcom Watersheds Information Network, that is a group of it's a loose coalition of agencies, nonprofits, and private citizens who work together to do outreach. And the PUD has been a member of that, and I am their representative. I'm involved on their steering committee, Whatcom Water Week, and I'm becoming more involved in their speaker series group as well. So we work together, the staff time, and we try to do the best we can. We aren't necessarily funded except through our staff time, but one of the grants I'm managing this year is an outreach and education grant that is providing some funding for support to the information network, where we're able to have some consultants do work for us. The other groups that you see down here, of course, the Nooksack Salmon Enhancement Association, they've been around for many years, and the PUD has been supporting some of their mitigation actions for since 2010. And we continue to give them a little money every year to do primarily culvert replacements. And Daryl Grave he's one of their main project managers. He comes every year and does a really nice presentation, usually in the early spring, showing what our funds helped to do for the recovery and culvert removal. Watershed improvement districts and water districts and water associations, they are all working together in partnerships as part of the watershed management project as well, Ag Water Board, and then of course the state agencies of health, ecology, and fish and wildlife. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the evolution of the YR1 watershed management, and it's pre-2000. The Watershed Management Act was created in 1997, and it was a statewide basin planning effort. And prior to that, or right when they started that, the Nooksack Water User Steering Committee was working towards that kind of an effort. And Steve can speak to that because he was actually on that steering committee when he got invited in 93 when you got here, isn't that right, Steve?
Yeah,
93.
November.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then once again, the Watershed Information Network started back then in the early or late 1990s was the first Whatcom watershed. I came to work for the PUD in 99, but by that time we were into the watershed planning project, and we had an outreach effort that kind of took care of the outreach. So the Whatcom Watershed Information Network wasn't as active after that. And then as the planning effort started, they created the joint board, and just so you understand that the state law created what they called initiating governments in the law. That's the 9082, RCW 9082, that created the initiating governments, which consisted of the county. So Whatcom County, the largest city in the county, so city of Bellingham, the largest water purveyor, which was the PUD. And the reason why we were considered the largest public water purveyor is because we have the legal authority to serve everywhere in Whatcom County.
Well, I think what the law said was that they picked the largest city and then the largest water purveyor that was not the city.
Right.
So I think that's why we were selected, yeah.
And then of course the two tribes. So those were the initiating governments of the Wire One planning process. Then they also
Just a quick, I think what the law said was that it created or established the initiating governments, which was City of Bellingham and the county and then the PUD. And then it said that those three could invite, if there were tribes in the basin, they could invite the tribes to participate, which we did. And then they decided to form the joint board, which was the administrative opportunity to establish and then manage the watershed plan.
Thank you. And then within that RCW, it was strongly encouraged that the initiating governments create a planning unit of stakeholders. And this WIRA One chose to do a pretty broad stakeholder. And I believe at one time there were 18 caucuses participating, 16 to 18. I should have looked back at the numbers, but it includes environmental caucus, ag caucus, private well owner caucus, small non-government water systems like water associations, water the city, any of the initiating governments were on the planning unit as well. So there was City of Bellingham, PUD, Whatcom County, and then ecology, or the state could have a representative. So ecology was always there, but sometimes we did have Forest Service as one of the planning unit members. I also left out land development. I can't remember if there's any more, Steve. I got the majority of them, I believe. So that they had to work together to make a plan. So we started in 2000 and it took us until 2005. We had planning unit meetings monthly, and we literally had them every month except maybe December. So that was a lot of time and energy that was put into this by not just the initiating governments, by the stakeholders as well. So
Rebecca,
yeah,
I have a question. I've always wondered, why are we one?
oh, that was all set up by that was all set up by the Department of Ecology, and I think they just started in the northwest corner of the state.
Okay,
I think it was just that was why. Yeah.
Okay.
Pretty sure.
All right.
Yeah.
Good
So it's easy.
Okay.
We're number one. Yay.
We're the best. Right? Okay.
So
all right.
So between 2006 and 2009, we started to ramp up to do the implementation of the plan. And at that time we started talking about, because what I didn't mention was at the same time that the watershed management group was working, there was also the salmon recovery plan that had been approved. It's RCW 7785, excuse me. And so they were working in parallel with the watershed management group. The salmon recovery group was working, and there was a lot of overlap with the same people, particularly with the tribes and the county. The PUD did not sit on that recovery board. Because we didn't have, we were not doing fish biology things. So we did not sit on that board, but all the other initiating governments did sit on that board, so there was a lot of overlap, so that there was a plan to integrate both programs after both of these plans got approved. And I believe that Salmon Recovery Plan also got approved in 2005 or 2006. Pretty sure it was 2005. And so what we did after that, well, one of the things that we did do, we had a lower Nooksack strategy work plan, and I can let Steve maybe address this a little bit. And we were trying to integrate a lot of programs that we thought would help implement what we wanted to do with the watershed management plan.
Just a note though, the lower Nooksack strategy was the outcome. There were two different, out of the 2005 watershed management plan, they identified two different pilot projects to try to negotiate water settlements in the basin. One of them was the Bertrand, and one of them was the Middle Fork, which eventually became all three forks. And Bertrand, they worked at, they had discussions meetings for several months and came to a sort of hit a wall and decided, the working group decided that they were not going to be able to have any success in completing those negotiations. So they put that on pause, went over to the Middle Fork. They decided, they being the state, the tribes, city of Bellingham, decided that they would enlarge that to include all three tributaries, or the Middle Fork, South Fork, North Fork, into those negotiations. Those negotiations appeared to have some success coming. And so late in the process, they asked the PUD and the county, because the PUD was actually managing a grant from the Department of Ecology for those negotiations, to ask us to come up with okay, what happens next? And if the Middle Fork or Three Forks negotiations are successful, we came up with the lower Nooksack strategy, which had 5 different elements to it. Doesn't make any difference what those are, but the third element was completing a water supply plan. And that was discussed at planning unit. It was discussed at the Watershed Management Board. And so that was the beginning of the 5-year work plan for the Watershed Management Board. So that's how that came about.
Say, Rebecca.
Yes.
Is it around 2005 or maybe 03 that, besides all this watershed management going on, isn't that when we started offering throughout the county workshops, trying to educate people? And where you spent an awful lot of your time putting together?
That was part of the PI team, Public Information and Education team.
Okay.
And we did go and we did open houses, we did meetings around the county, because this was a big stakeholder group of people that, I mean, it was really challenging, because you're trying to get a lot of diverse groups, environmental caucus versus, I don't want to say verse, but there's an environmental caucus and a land development caucus. So that there were some different things going on between those two, not to mention all the other caucuses that were part of it. And so it took 5 years to get that plan done. And we did do a lot of outreach. We had many meetings, and there were about 3 years, I believe, maybe 2 years, where we would have a big booth out at the Linden Fair, and we had a big map of the whole basin, and we had education outreach information there. We would be there from sun up to sundown at the fair for a week, doing that kind of outreach. So yeah, there was a lot of time and energy put into the outreach. And we hope it was successful. We did get the plan approved through the whole process. So we thought that was pretty successful, even though it took 5 years. Some of the other WIRAs that did watershed planning, some of them had smaller planning unit groups, and maybe just stuck with mostly agencies like the tribes and the county and some of the larger cities. So not everybody did that. We really went I'm saying we, the initiating governments, including the tribes, wanted everybody at the table to try to help come up with a plan that people could accept. So that was, I think, I mean, it took 5 years, but we were patient and got it done. And the funding did come through. So there was grant funding from the ecology, I believe 250,000 a year, but there was also more money spent than that. And that came through the county's flood tax zone. So it was funded, some from the state, primarily from the taxpayers of Whatcom County. So it was important to make sure that those people had a voice.
Rebecca?
Mhm.
Why don't we move through this last, the 2018 to 22? And then I think we'll wrap this up.
Yep.
This section of it up and give John Sitkin some time because
Sure.
has to head off to Blaine for a city
Oh,
council meeting.
okay.
So,
Well, we can come back to this later. I think this is almost my, well, it's not almost my last slide. I got 2 more slides, but this is just to show you the structure of the Watershed Management Board as it is now. The 2 combined boards combined in 2016. Now we meet together as one. And now we do have a board work plan that's it's been updated. So this is a 2018 to 2023. So we'll start again next year updating it. And I'll just move ahead because it's just a little bit more detail on that. So we'll save that for another. Okay, did you want to take a break or do you just want to continue on?
I think we better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you good?
Okay.
Yeah, let's keep going.
Oh,
Okay,
well,
John, you
once-
just have,
What?
just tell me when I need to change your slides, John.
Okay, so I'll get up here, catch up. I got the same one here. So let's go to the next slide.
Could I just really quickly, if we look at our strategic plan, if we look at strategy WR1, WR2 and WR3, participate in countywide adjudication process, protecting and preserving water rights, supporting the water rights settlement effort, and identify points of agreement concurrent with adjudication, and utilize PUD water rights to enable solution. I think that's where John's going to be really covering not only the basics of water rights, but we talk about adjudication and other things.
We'll get to what the adjudication process is at the end, but I need to set the foundation of water law. And then some of the decisions that affect PUD's water right, what's open issues that may be litigated. So it's a basic water law concept, so everyone has the same kind of sheet of music we're singing from. So Washington adopted the Western water law principle applies to most Western states that require appropriation doctrines. First in time, first in right. It means the senior water right is protected from impairment by junior water right users. So junior in time can be shut off in whole or in part if their water use impairs a senior water right. Your water right is generally reflected by a water right certificate. There are some other circumstances. A certificate is issued by the Department of Ecology. It's a paper certificate. Those water rights certificates would have been issued for surface water code after 1917 appropriations, and groundwater rights certificate after the groundwater code was after 1945. If a party feels that they established a water right by use of the water prior to those dates, when drilling a well in the ground in 1940, there were times when the state opened up periods of called the water claim registry, where to claim that right that existed pre those codes, you had to file a claim with the state during an open period. And those periods have been open 3 or 4 times since the late 1960s. So if you did not timely file a claim to a pre-groundwater code groundwater use appropriation or pre-1917 surface water use, you would not be able to assert a pre-code claim. Then there are what people refer to as the exempt wells, and those really are just exempt from having to obtain a certificate.
Can you move your microphone a little
Sure.
closer to yourself, John?
Sure, these are
Thank you.
the exempt groundwater wells that people refer to. The exemption is certain uses under certain limitations are exempt from having to obtain a certificate of water right. They still have to meet other elements of the water right, such as putting in beneficial use, and there are certain limitations for the exemption. 5,000 gallons per day for singular group domestic, for example. State has the doctrine of relinquishment, meaning you must use your water right or you lose it, or could use a portion of the water right. So if you did not use all of your water right over a 5-year period in any particular year, you could use that portion, lose that portion that you did not use. That could be applied to your acre feet, instantaneous quantity, your area of use, could be any element of your water. And there's what the federal winners doctrine, which is a federal reserve rights, which includes treaty rights, could be a federal park water right. Those are reserved rights for the federal government, and under the Supreme Court case, the winners doctrine, they are the senior water rights on the river or in our something.
I have a question.
Sure.
So with relinquishment, how is this even tracked? How would,
It has not been, and that's going to be the adjudication.
okay,
That'll be a large part of the adjudication. Someone has that. And I've seen estimates in public of the 60 to 70% of the agricultural water rights are illegal. In that maybe they change their point of appropriation without going through a change process with the state, get their new point of appropriation legal, valid, approved. That arguably is, they've abandoned then the original appropriation point because it was not used for a 5-year period. You could argue that they've lost their entire water right off that point of appropriation because it was relocated. Maybe they can argue it's a replacement and technically acceptable. The reality is, over the years, families have bought and sold pieces of their farm and didn't change their water right. They may have changed their use. They may have put in drip irrigation that could conserve water and use less water, but irrigate more crops. But they lost some of their certificate of water right because they utilized a more efficient water use. So the doctrine of relinquishment has some public policy validity, but it also has unintended consequences as it disincentivizes conservation. So it's one of the debates around utilizing having the doctrine of relinquishment in state laws, the unintended consequences and the disincentivized conservation.
There's a case going on right now and with city of Pasco and an irrigation district on the east side where the irrigation district had been approved for an additional water right. They didn't use any of that new additional water right, and now they're entered into an agreement with the city of Pasco to transfer that portion of their water right over, and ecology is saying, no, you can't do that because you haven't used it.
So we'll touch on this, but this is a significant issue under the municipal water law that a number of us pursued over a number of years because ecology essentially asserted that the doctrine of relinquishment applied to municipal water users regardless of the growing community circumstance.
Does
So,
relinquishment,
John, go ahead, Atul. I was going to just make sure John answered your
Yes.
question.
does relinquishment apply to exempt wells?
yes, all water use. So relinquishment could be an issue in litigation and adjudication for the exempt well, even if ecology sets forth a process that is supposed to streamline the adjudication for exempt wells or some off ramp. You can't assume that ecology process is going to be valid because the ecology is talking about setting a process that exempt wells will be determined valid if they agree to X number of gallons per day for single family residents. Well, any party can challenge that because that runs afoul of the doctrine of relinquishment. Because if a single well owner doesn't have records showing that they've used 800 or 500 gallons a day, and they can only show they've used 250 gallons a day, why would they get an automatic permit for 500 gallons a day? So every private well owner is subject to a challenge in the adjudication under the doctrine of relinquishment to be able to establish what they have. Now, ecology may adopt some policies, presuming a court may or may not adopt that says a single family well without records of consumptive use is going to presume to have used X number of gallons per day. I've heard them say it's gonna be 500. That's interesting. The Department of Health is using 350 gallon per day used for water system planning purposes and for group A systems. So how they get 500 gallons a day when the Department of Health has used 350 gallons a day for single family residents. Well, these are all issues that are micro, singular kind of topical issues for exempt well users in the adjudication that will could well be litigated depending upon who raises what issues. So the doctrine of relinquishment, yes, it can apply to exempt wells. This has been an issue we'll touch upon for municipal governments and why ecologies, we went through and did adopt what we had the legislature adopt what we call the municipal water law. And ecology by policy has tried to roll some of that back. They objected and contested and lobbied against the legislation and have since adopted policies that many people believe are inconsistent with the intent and language of the municipal water law code. So let's keep moving. Next slide. So some of the terminology issues everyone needs to be. Next slide, Rebecca.
I'm sorry, I don't know why it's not working. Huh. There we go.
There we go. There we go. So
Sorry.
some of the terminology to be aware of is priority date. That's would be the date of appropriation for the person, time, person, right. Your point of diversion or point of withdrawal. It could be where your well is or where your pump is, however it might be. The place of use, where you put the water to use. The purpose of your appropriation. Is it irrigation, crop irrigation, domestic, industrial, commercial. The QI, which is instantaneous quantity, usually measured in the cubic feet per second or GPM. That's an instantaneous, what you draw from your well in an instantaneous moment. And then QA, which is the annual quantity or volume, typically measured in acre feet per year. That's as you apply that water. Next slide. So the elements of a water right, that's what we just terminology, is a priority date. It has a point of appropriation in the source. The place to use it, there will be a map, a legal description associated with the water right. The instantaneous quantity amount will be defined, the annual quantity, the purpose of the use could be irrigation, it could be a time of use, it could be irrigation season, May through September, some can say. And there could be other elements you see more recently in the last 20, 30 years in a water rights certificate that has conditions, maybe some system requirements such as drip irrigation or other types of conditions associated with reporting requirements or metering requirements. So those are all, you have to look at the water rights certificate. So if you, someone who has a seasonal water right, sort of May through September, that uses it April through November are in violation of the law and in their water right. They don't risk losing it, but they risk penalties and enforcement and cease and desist orders or other types of penalties. Next slide. Your water rights certificate, the process to obtain that is generally it follows it's issued once the college does an inspection and proves that you've used it and you prove you use it for the beneficial use of the wells where you say it is, it's been used where you say it is. The priority date is based upon your application date. Certificate describes all attributes of the water right. It then attaches to the land. So it's not a personal property right that you get to take with you if you leave. It attaches to the land. Its attributes may be altered via a water right change application that goes to the Department of Ecology. And that change application is often an issue and has been an issue for municipal governments, is it opens up the validity of that water right. And essentially, a change application could cause the adjudication, if you will, of that singular water right as to what's legal or not, have they changed the use, what has happened, and that type of thing. You can have changes for administrative division, divided between properties or parcels. So someone could sell a parcel with so much water right on it, allocated to it because a water right may be serving 20 parcels of irrigation land and that type. But when you apply for a water rights certificate, they can open up the issues of relinquishment or abandonment. Next slide. Your tests are essentially a 4-right test. Is a proposed use a beneficial use? It's a broad term, essentially not wasting it. Is the water physically available? Can you actually obtain the water? And is it legally available? In other words, will it impair senior water rights? And this has been the issue that tribes and senior water right holders have claimed, is that, and this is the Hearst case, is that legally available has to consider whether you're impairing senior water right, and why is ecology issuing water rights or allowing groundwater exempt wells to be issued when they impair senior water right? And the question is the proposed use in the public interest? That converts the question of that into detrimental to the public welfare, and it's very few would be detrimental to the public welfare. So that's all. It's almost a throwaway test, but it's again to prevent waste. Next slide. We talked about exempt withdrawals. They're exempt from the permit process, but not the water code, so they can be shut off if they impair senior water right. They are subject to all other rules. Essentially, as we said before, it's 5,000 gallons per day for domestic use, industrial uses, unlimited stock watering. The issues become, what about closed basins such as largely Nooksack Basin? How do you document their use? So one exempt well per project and uses where you saw for years what developers we would call, or developer community would call, the daisy chain small water systems. You'd have one well serving 6 units, which is a Group B water system approved by the county. And then you have the road connect to the next phase of the best short plat, 6 lots, another well, another Group B water system, and do the PUD number 2 water system. And then the road would extend the next, so you daisy chain these short plats over a series of properties on a series of Group B water systems, all on a series of exempt wells. So you're having multiple straws into one drink, and ecology came around and said, no, you can't have, that's circumventing rules that the development plan, a scheme that has multiple phases like that are one project, and you can't daisy chain those type of developments. Hard for ecology to enforce that, or because they're not really involved in the process for short plats. And the county doesn't really strictly apply that or enforce that either. So that has been lost. So the relinquishment doctrine, next slide. Again, use it or lose it. Continuous beneficial use during the 5-year period. It applies to all non-municipal water rights, and only recently did it apply to non-city municipal water rights, such as the water district PUD. And that's the municipal law we spoke about. However, it does not apply to in-stream flows, nor tribal rights or federal reserve rights. Significant issue for agriculture, as you mentioned. Next slide. So the Winters Doctrine I mentioned is when the federal government sets aside a reserve some of its land for a federal purpose. The court said by implication, and reserves the impertinent water then unappropriate to the extent needed to accomplish the purpose of the reservation. This will be a significant issue litigated in the adjudication. What is the purpose of the Lummi Nation and the tribe and the Nooksack litigation? They will assert, all you may agree, parties to the litigation may dispute this. The United States established a reserved water right at best no later than the date of the creation of the reservation. So at issue will be when were the reservations created or recognized. It could be different for the Lummi than the Nooksack. Applies to national parks and military bases, Indian reservations. Lummi Nation is a fishing tribe that has been recognized by court cases. So it'll be get into the details on it. The purpose of the reservation is essentially to have a sustainable harvest for the tribe. We may have lots of debates in the adjudication about the purpose of the reservation, the scope of what their water right might be, what is a sustainable harvest, all those type of things. I'm not saying anything that anyone in the business isn't aware of that's coming. So federal reserve rights preempt state law. States may not limit or curtail those federal reserve rights, so the state doctrine of relinquishment does not apply. We use it or lose it. If the state doctrine of relinquishment is state law only. Next slide. So Lummi Nation claims it claims a treaty right to water that creates all other uses and requires federal protection. It is a consumptive right to support sustainable harvest a surplus of salmon. That's quoted from PowerPoint with Lummi representative. The Lummi Nation in 2011 submitted a request to the United States seeking a quantification of their in-stream flow rate. At the time is immemorial. And needed this from protection from poor state management of water. Federal governments did not start a federal adjudication. The request was to quantify the tribal in-stream flow rate. And they said it was a request for a negotiated settlement in lieu of a federal adjudication. That was in 2011. That almost 10 years since, it has not occurred. So we'll talk about what led out of this and the lack of action of a negotiated settlement that led to the adjudication. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. So next slide, recent court decisions we'll go through. So next slide. There's a summary of the recent case, and we'll go a little bit more detail. The first is that 1 molecule is the standard for impairment. It is not a de minimis. It doesn't have to be, well, you didn't really, so what, you're 2 feet off the line, that's de minimis. We're not going to worry about it. No, 1 molecule is the standard of impairment. The law does not allow for de minimis impairment.
The challenge on that is you don't have to approve. Ecology doesn't have to prove that there is an impact or an impairment. You have to prove that there is not. Yeah.
The burden's on the party seeking the water use. Any effect on the flow or the level of surface water in its flow stream is impairment. Now we'll get into issues probably in adjudication about temperature as well as flow. So it could be wide in scope of what the issues might be. There was a provision in the state water code where overriding considerations of public interest OCPI could be used to impair existing stream flows by administrative rules, and if you had the appropriate mitigation plans, and that has since been rejected by the courts. That would be used by municipal governments to allow some use and exceeds that may impair a senior water right, but they would offset that by mitigation, either in kind, meaning water for water, or out of kind, meaning some other habitat or other type of environmental mitigation. And that has been recently in the last 10 years rejected by the courts. Then the Hearst case, which many people here are familiar with, that the county is not looking at the legality of the availability of water and cannot sanction new permit exempt wells if they're pumping intercepts water needed for fish supply. The legal availability of water must be considered. So we'll talk about that in greater detail. Now, let's have an aside. This decision, to me, having been in the land use realm county for 30 years, was wholly unsurprising. It had been, the county did not look at any of the required levels of service, legal availability of services, whether water, otherwise, for decades, it would just issue permits. If someone applied and wasn't meeting the requirements of law, when it issued those kind of permits and determining legal availability or the availability of services. I had a case on fire service. I went to the Supreme Court and prevailed on that the county failed to analyze those questions. So we have the fire. So this is not a shocking decision. The county tried to get out of its obligation and talk about it by deferring to the Department of Ecology, and it's really ecology that has to enforce this, and if they don't enforce, that's their issue, and the court said no. So next slide. I may have talked about this already, but this is the Hearst case that the Supreme Court said the county failed to meet with its requirements of growth management to protect water resources. It has to make an independent decision about water availability. It cannot rely strictly on the Department of Ecology. Rebecca, next slide, sorry. And this court decision changed how all Washington counties would decide to approve or deny building permits. Rebecca, did you hear me? Next slide.
Okay, this is the one I was on. And then it came to this one.
Rebecca?
I have my, can you,
I can keep going.
Why don't you do that?
So this resulted in the Stream Flow Restoration Act of 2018 that directed ecology And 15 planning groups to develop watershed plans to offset the impacts of new domestic permit exempt wells to achieve a net ecological benefit. They appropriated over legislature had over $300 million to support projects. They had to have a deadline for YR1 by 2019 to update the watershed management plan. And if not, the college was going to adopt a new rule by the next year. And the local community could not enter into, come to agreement on what the appropriate net ecological development benefit might be, or watershed plan would be. So ecology adopted a rule. And it amended the in-stream flow rule, essentially saying new permit exempt wells may withdraw up to 500 gallons a day, which was 300 less. And have, if they paid a $500 fee, 350 to county and 150 to
Yeah, there were-
150 to Whatcom County, 350 to ecology. Yet the county had to track all the building permits and report to ecology and report water limitations on the title property.
Hmm.
You get a move forward.
She said she got it.
Hey, John,
I'll go to foster and ecology. And Rebecca, if you hear me, I'm on slide 41 now. Foster versus ecology, this was the case that overturned the OCPI, the overriding considerations of public interest. City of Yelm had developed a plan that had habitat restoration, as I recall, so not in kind, not water for water mitigation, but a habitat restoration to offset the impacts caused by a new withdrawal. And if they felt it was a de minimis impairment of in-stream flows that well over mitigated, 3-to-1 plus kind of ratio concept. That was challenged, and the Supreme Court ruled that only in-kind water for water mitigation was allowed. But moreover, the overriding consideration of public interest that allowed for impairment was illegal and overturned that provision of the statute. So you cannot permanently impair a senior water right by mitigation under the current water code, and only exceptions for temporary impairment would be allowed.
Interesting thing, they did just reach a decision, Yelm and Department of Ecology on a new mitigation plan.
Yeah.
So they got their water rights.
So the Foster decision impacts, and there's a there was a task force to try to address these that has not come up with a they have a report by the end of this year. Everyone's busy trying to influence the direction of this report. But you will find that well, many people that believe it should to offset any de minimis impact, but we'll see what happens out of legislature. I'm on slide 43 now. I want to talk about the municipal water law. This is the Crown West case at its Eastern Washington, but largely you really dive into it. There's a lot of speculation by a developer that was trying to become more municipal purveyor, working with the municipal government to put the water to beneficial use as a municipal purveyor. Ecology and the Attorney General's office said that beneficial use is determined by applicant compliance. You have to put the water to beneficial use, and that is the issue. Well, how can a growing community who knows they're going to grow, has a mandate to plan under the Growth Management Act for a number of years, have a water that's unused? How can it, or the inchoate water right, the unused portion of the certificate of water right, how can it plan if it loses its water? So what is active compliance? Ecology has a policy. It's not adopted in law or regulation. And it's contested by many of you utility purveyors. But essentially, if you have actively pursuing a water system plan and trying to develop your water system proactively, then you may keep that portion of your inchoate water right. But it begs questions of, can you change the purpose? Can you use that inchoate water right for mitigation? Can you change the appropriate point of appropriation of your unused portion of your certificate of water right? And if you seek a change, do you trigger quantification or of a water right and putting the input right at risk? So it's a lot of untested, uncertain question. Many of these issues will likely be addressed in the context of an adjudication.
This is essentially what happened with the city of Linden.
Yes.
City of Linden had water rights that were based somewhat on their growth projections back in the 1950s. But they had three vegetable treatment plants, processing plants in the city using a lot of water. Those plants closed and ecology came back and said, you don't need that much water. We're curtailing this much of your water right. And they've been dealing with it ever since, trying to figure out how to get enough water for their growth projections.
Okay, next slides. We're gonna talk about adjudication now. So it's a legal process to determine who has a valid water right, how much water can be used, and who has priority for use during shortages. That's the simple concept of an adjudication. It is the state will appoint a superior court judge to be the water, to take these water right cases. We presume that'll be one judge in the Whatcom County Superior Court, and there's already the state, Whatcom County Superior Court's already working with the state court administration to get the funding for an additional judge to handle this. We assume it'll be one judge rather than spread it. There were 5 judges who will have to have expertise, and more likely, like in the Yakima, one or two judges. It is currently the only definitive way to have a legal binding process for making these determinations. Persons or tribes claiming a water right must make their claim in the local superior court. They may be small in size, or they can be large general adjudication like the Nooksack Center. Federal adjudication only address the federal reserve rights like the tribal claims. They could have done just done the tribal rights by federal courts, and then the states courts would have to recognize that. Or you can go through state adjudication that will address all the state issued water right claims. The tribes, next slide. I'll get this. So adjudication, I said this again, it'll be a superior court case that enter legal rulings under Washington law and winter rights doctrine. Because the tribes ask for the state adjudication, they forego their federal adjudication right. So they are in the state court and will have the state courts adjudicate the scope of their winter doctrine rights. So that was a significant aspect of what the tribes asked for. It'll be evidentiary hearings regarding each and every claim to water right. And each certificate, each claim, historical claim, and it could be every permit. Anyone who claims to have a water right will have an evidentiary hearing on both water and surface rights. Their trial cuts, an evidentiary hearing. It's a trial on each right, and you'll hear evidence, expert evidence. Ecology will present some evidence. It could be in writing, they could have oral testimony. Some of ecology presumably will just submit things in writing, and then there'll be a property owner to bring in their own evidence, their own testimony to dispute that. It review all claimed rights and based on those water rights and considering a relinquishment, results in a final decree that is a listing of the priority of the dates and the amount of water and those legal rights. And that's all it is. It doesn't have an enforcement order to shut somebody off. You just get a tabulation of the rights, senior to junior. They can issue, the court may have an authority to issue orders barring use that is beyond an asserted claim. So during the course of the adjudication, by example of a May to September, right? Someone is using historically used April that's nowhere in there, right? They may get an order that says do not commence until May 1st. And then in violation of that would be a contempt of court. It can take years and decades, and it took decades in Yakima. So here are the subbasins of next slide, sorry, 47. These are the subbasins of the Nooksack YRO1. Not all of these are in the Nooksack Basin. For instance, coastal north by and large is not in the Nooksack Basin. Chilliwack is not in the Nooksack Basin, and I don't think Sumas or Portland.
Portions of Sumas are, yeah. In fact, Sumas has 2 wells in the Nooksack Basin. The other is that ecology had noted that Point Roberts is going to be included in the adjudication process. Yeah. It's part of,
Next slide.
I'm really
So
glad.
here's the history of
I'm
the-
really glad the Department of Ecology is making sure so that Point Roberts doesn't feel excluded.
So next slide.
The
well, next slide,
inclusive
adjudication.
approach to adjudication.
So the history is in 2020, the two tribes, the nation and the tribe asked the state of Washington to commence the state right adjudication. In July last year, Ecology entered the pre-adjudication process to start preparing. They have to set up their offices, very quick the funding, determine what's necessary. It's taken some time. They've been engaged in mapping, they're identifying the water users, conducting outreach, all the rest. It said this preliminary phase will take 2 years, so that'll be next year. We expect the Ecology to see that they have asked for a budget authority to commence the adjudication next year. And now they intend on starting that by filing with the court, a summons and complaint and related to exec adjudication and serving all the parties with the lawsuit on the adjudication. Anybody who has a water right, groundwater well, exempt well, anything should be anticipate being served with a summons and complaint by the Department of Ecology sometime this time next year.
Does that actually mean that all those people being contacted actually have to respond?
If they want to try to defend their water right, yes.
So the average private well owner will have to go out and
Yes.
hire an attorney?
Well,
join
the
with-
Ecology says they're gonna have a streamlined process to allow groundwater exempt well owners have a process to whether through short forms and a short abbreviated process, they're going to propose a process for to expedite it. But as I said, that process is not in statute. That process is not been adopted or approved by court. It's not in rule. So Ecology is going to have to propose something in the legislature, have it adopted, or have it proposed to the court. But even so, all those water rights can impair a senior water right. So I would expect to have a process to allow people to challenge someone who claims a water right under a exempt, remember, it's just exempt from certificate for these smaller groundwater appropriations. Just because they're exempt from the certificate does not mean they're exempt from the rules of relinquishment or priorities for the barring impairments. So I would tell a water well owner, be prepared to have your data to show how much water you've used within your authority of the exemption to show how much water you've used over the last 5 years at a minimum, and defend that with back to the data that you started. So you have a procedure. You want a 1960 point of appropriation rather than a 1980 point date of appropriation. You want to have used, 600, 700 gallons a day and document it and have evidence of it rather than only showing 250 gallons a day. They'll equate something that says you have how many toilets are in your house. We have 3 toilets. We presumptive family of 4. That's going to equal this amount of water usage for toilets and this many sinks, and family 4 uses this much water typically a day or 3 showers. They're going to have some standardized basis to say this is what the baseline is. And someone can challenge that and say, no, we think that's too high for this family 4 would be. They don't use 350, they use 250. And that, all those issues could be litigated. But so there's supposed to be a streamlined process. We don't know what it will be. So the best advice is to be prepared.
Well, I think one of the bigger challenges is, of the 15,000 or so exempt wells out there in Whatcom County. How many of those property owners don't even know they have? Or if they do, have no record whatsoever. Don't even know that they have an exempt well permit. I mean, it's going to be very, very difficult.
So what happens is you get the summons and complaints, there'll be a deadline to respond. First, you respond by asserting your claim, then you'll have a point that will put your evidence, facts, testimony, support of the claim. College is anticipating having an online e-filing process for this to try to make it easier. I mean, I don't know if e-filing is going to make it easier for some people or not. Presumably they'll be able to file it by mail or by electronically, but there'll be a deadline, and if you don't, you're out. And then they'll have a process for adjudicating what you've filed, whether they think that's made up or legitimate, and allow some people the chance to challenge those if they want, and then there'll be determination. Ecology and all parties can propose a process that court will issue pre-trial orders. Ecology prepares a report of finding for each asserted water right claim. And that should include the groundwater wells that are exempt from the certificate. And any party may object to the asserted claim and ecology's findings, and that would then result into an evidentiary hearing. And again, the court issues a final decree. Next slide and last slide.
So just to
So it's a
clarify,
unique issue. Yeah.
I had a conversation with Robin, interaction with questions to Robin McPherson about this. There's also exempt wells which are non-residential.
Yes,
You want to talk?
industrial.
We have
It'd
them.
be the same thing. They may have a standard that they have, or they may have an online process, an abbreviated process for them or not. But there are exemptions, are not just for single and group domestic, there are for 5,000 gallons a day for industrial uses and some unlimited stock watering and for other agricultural uses. And ecology may or may not have a streamlined process for that.
And what I got the
But
impression,
those are part of the adjudication process.
the impression I got from Robin is that there will be more scrutiny on the exempt non-residential, and there'll be try to be a catch-all way to do. But I don't know what they'll actually do.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I appreciate that. I think the reality of this is politics interfering, intersecting into the process. Ecology is trying to forestall a political outcry by the exempt well users for a single family domestic by having a streamlined process for them, but are going to be more rigid and treat the other exempt well users as a traditional water right holder. There's no reason for that distinction in the law. It is a political reaction. Okay. So last slide here, we have up next steps. Oh, excuse me. The next slide is unique issues. Last slide, unlike so I'm on slide 50 now. Unlike the Yakima Basin adjudication, this is groundwater as well as surface water claims. So next slide. We have exempt wells, which really were not present in the Yakima Basin. The records that exist in the Nooksack Basin do not reflect actual or legal uses. Includes all rights, then they're subject to relinquishment, except for owner's rights, so that'll be litigated. All the rights will be subject to impairments. Presently, the federal and tribal rights are not quantified, so that's going to be a big part of litigation. And again, as I said earlier, many basin water right holders have changed their use or their right without going through a change process, but change the use or point of appropriations or quantities over years, and they may not align with the elements of their water right, and that's going to be an issue. And so those will be litigated, and that's going to be what's harmful for a lot of people.
I think one of the other challenges on the exempt wells, as we look at how exempt wells are distributed across the entire basin, is that if the tribes make a claim on their reserved rights for stream flow, that could vary from tributary to tributary to tributary, and that may impact the junior or senior classification for any exempt well. So you may have exempt well in Fish Trap Creek Basin, and the tribes say, we don't need any more water in Fish Trap Creek, so give them whatever they're claiming. But you move over to Anderson Creek and maybe just the opposite. So it's gonna be a
greatly different basin by basin, area by area, and it depends. And that we know ecology is already engaged in hired biologists and hydrogeologists. So it is not going to be simple or easy litigation. Okay, yeah. You go through my next two slides and get up to 53 to get up to Steve, your next.
all right. Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we can go to the next slide, which should be how water services are organized in Whatcom. There we go. So essentially, here's who is engaged in providing water service in the Whatcom County. There are the cities, the 6 cities, water districts, which are public agencies, water associations, Group A's, Group B's. Group A's are any system or association that provides 15 or more connections. Private Group B's are 14 down to 2. So if you have a single exempt well, you're not going to be an association. So if you have 2 up to 14, you'll be in the Group B. Above 15, you'll be a Group A's. Private exempt wells, and of course the Whatcom PUD, which is a sort of a separate situation all itself. Next slide. So we look at our water rights, and we have a total of 83 cubic feet per second, CFS. That's instantaneous. And we have purpose of use on our 3 water rights, actually 4 with the exempt well, for municipal purposes, industrial purposes, and irrigation. We have about 5,600 acre feet of municipal and industrial, and then also about 6,200 acre feet of irrigation water rights that are very specific to place of use and purpose of use. We have 1 water plant at River Mile 5.3, which is our Ferndale, which is the one that the picture is of. Plant 2 is located here at 9.2 River Mile. The plants serve Cherry Point industrial customers, BP, Phillips, Alcoa, AltaGas, PSE Whitehorn Generating Station, PSE Ferndale Generation, which is the largest one. Chemco, Free Rain Farms, which was a different company that started an in-greenhouse grow-op and legally, and they changed their name, new ownership a couple of years ago. Plus, depending upon the rental leasing of property, we have on average about 30 irrigation customers.
Say, Steve, your picture there must be 10 to 15 years old.
Pretty close. Well, we started, yeah, it's probably about 10 years old, probably.
Yeah, because a new modern one would really be something to see too.
Yeah,
with all the changes.
Yep. Next slide, please. Grandview system, Grandview Northgate I-5 industrial area. We have, if we look at the number of meters that we are connected to, we have about 42 to 43 right now, but they are only about 30 different customers. And the 3 wells, we have 1 potable well and then 2 other wells, 1 small casing, 1 a little bit larger casing that we had used for our fire system before we made the connection to our industrial system off of Vista Road. But what our water rights for those 3 wells indicate is that we can use all 3 of the wells to serve our potable system if we chose to. We would have to do some different interties and some treatment system at the 2 fire wells. Those 2 fire wells are located in 1 building, 1 6-inch casing, 1 16-inch casing. And water right for potable that we can use from all 3 of those, I said. And then we have the 1 groundwater exempt well at Cherry Point that we serve Praxair with their potable needs. That is on paper says that we can use up to 5,000 gallons a day. It is for industrial purposes only. In 2021, we completed our water system plan, which really highlighted the ability for us to serve certain areas of Whatcom County with our water supply if we chose to. And that was critical as we had the discussion over the time that we were developing the plan. It was critical that we highlighted that in terms of our retail service area, our wholesale service area, and the entire county, which on our water rights, on our surface water rights out of the river, we indicate that we can serve them or use them to serve all areas of Whatcom County. Next slide. If we look at our strategic plan, goal 4, strategy 4.2, we highlight the willingness to continue to supply new and expanding technical support services to the local water supply community. That's all the Group A's and Group B's. There are about 415 independent Group A's and Group B's. That's broken down there. 181 Group A's and 234 Group B's. Again, that does not include exempt wells. It does not include individual wells. Next slide. Since 2010, the PUD facilitated and provided technical support to water associations and water systems. We've conducted 16 what we call major projects, all of which were grant funded. $2.7 million in outside grants and loans. The loans were then forgiven, so we don't have any outstanding loans through that $2.7 million. All of that's either been provided in out and out grants or forgiveness of loans. We have out of pocket, so our current customers have incurred doing all that. We've only incurred about $65,000 in administrative professional services that we've quote paid for. Highlights, I just wanted to call out North County Regional Nitrate Contamination Study, which led to $1 million in grants and loans for consolidation of 4 systems north and northeast of the city of Linden. We did 2 Badger Road pipeline crossings to make these connections, which ultimately alleviated the need for certain water rights to be used by those water associations. By making that connection, it cleaned up the water supply for those water associations, but it also created an opportunity for the city of Linden to purchase one of those systems and use that water right assigned to that system for their own needs. We've had completed several smaller feasibility study grants leading to additional consolidation. I think we've done 8 of those. I shouldn't say we, Dave Olson is, and our engineering firm, Wilson Engineering, had done all that work. We did get a 2-year DOH funded pilot program that Dave was able to use to provide technical, managerial, and financial capacity development for small drinking systems under 1,000 connections. That was a 2-year program. The last 3 years, we've contributed about $30,000 to $35,000 a year, and we're budgeted the same amount for 2023 to allow Dave to continue that work. He gets calls consistently month by month, just from private water associations asking for his advice, asking him what he can do. And we had success about 6 months ago on a system just off of Birch Bay Linden Road, Country Air. Dave, Department of Health and Department of Ecology was working together for about 3 years to get a new water right that allowed them to connect to the city of Linden and giving the city of Linden the appropriate amount of additional water right just to serve them. So it's those kind of things that Dave has been very successful at. Next slide.
Do you have the slide?
I can just.
Well, Steve, can you hear me?
Or Rebecca.
Steve, can you hear me? I'm showing on my screen the next slide. You're not seeing. What are you seeing?
Can you just?
I can
get
just,
us started?
yeah.
Okay.
I can read it. Let
The
me go back.
idea of Dave working with different system associations has been the idea of long-term sustainability for these water associations that are meeting sustainability issues. They're running out of, because of age, because of desire of operators, board members. They've got some financial problems. They've got supply problems. they're looking for solutions to those problems. And so Dave has been very helpful in making that connection to Department of Health grants and giving his advice. Recently, we just been awarded $70,000 in Department of Health grants to do 2 consolidation studies. One is the idea of connecting the Double L mobile home court just north of on Portal Way, and the other is the Fairfield Mobile Home Park just across Grandview from Grandview Industrial Park. Dave has also started and completed establishment of an active well monitoring pilot project where we're connecting or introducing gauges into private wells or wells that are part of an association supply to monitor the drop in level of water in those wells. That information is available through a link on our site, on our website. It's public information that's being generated. It will be for the next 3 years at no cost to the PUD. It's just a good public information access to what's going on in certain areas of the county. Recently, we've just adopted this interlocal agreement that we're going to be sending off to Whatcom County to talk about us possibly taking over water associations if they find themselves in receivership with the Whatcom County. That has not, we haven't advanced that to the county yet. We will be. And then we've adopted a policy on assistance to water systems, which really says, here's what we are willing to consider doing when a system finds themselves in a situation that they have where they don't know what to do, where they potentially are losing board members, losing operators, losing or having a problem with water rights. And I think when we do the feasibility studies on the 2 mobile home parks, it'll be a good, I'll call it good pilot or a good approach to using that policy to determine how we gauge whether or not we should help in managing, operating, or owning a system. Next slide.
Okay,
Why don't we
Steve, I
skip
I
to-
apologize, you guys. I don't know what's going on with my computer, but here you go. Did that work?
That works.
That works.
Okay.
And I'll
It's-
be
Yeah, sorry.
I'll be really quick on this. This is just a slide that Dave had developed when he was going through the work through the 2-year program and then continuing on. What it basically shows is that on the left side of that hill, systems are struggling in terms of their capacity for technical, managerial, financial support, and they don't know where to turn. We've engaged Dave through the 2-year program and ongoing now the last 3 years to provide advice, make connections to the Department of Health grants. Department of Health grants are different forms, different purposes. Provide that and then provide advice on how to meet needs, and especially around infrastructure and then certified operators. And as you go up to the top of that hill and that support is provided, then we move to the other side and we try to keep those systems sustainable without having us step in and manage or operate. And so far it's been very successful. Next slide. Really quickly, in your strategic plan in WS1, WS2, we specifically call out different ways to serve agriculture and trying to find new methodologies to do that. I think that what we've identified over the years are really our few options, mainly pipelines, storage, interties between existing systems, direct sale by the PUD, pipelines, that kind of a thing. And then the possibility of moving water rights. The moving water rights is most problematic in terms of what John had indicated, especially if it's surface water in COIT rights. It's almost impossible to do that today. But if we look at the entire basin as a system, and we look at exchanging water rights where we can supply water to an association, and then they can, quote, release their water rights for us to use in that same area of the county for other purposes. I think there are some options. And then the resiliency plan that we completed in 2019. If we look at our strategies, WS1 and WS2, we talk about opportunities to use the drought resiliency plan to identify projects, storage, interties, and so forth, that we can call upon, especially with the Bureau of Reclamation granting program, the Water Smart program, to pay for some of those kinds of projects. And we have that, the local committee that was formed and developed the resiliency plan now has not been active for several years. And my recommendation is that we may think about trying to reinvigorate that working committee, especially in light of opportunities for federal and state funding now. Next slide, quickly. This is an example of a possibility of what we're calling the North County Regional Water System, which is would have partners, including PUD, the Birch Bay Water and Sewer District, City of Blaine, some of the watershed improvement districts, and then the City of Linden. And essentially what it is looking at the deep wells that Birch Bay and Blaine have drilled and utilize those, utilize water rights that could be established for taking water out of those deep wells, and to form a plan to improve stream flow, habitat, provide water for municipal, industrial, and irrigation in that northwest, and then across the north part of the county. And all I can say is that those discussions continue. Next slide.
So that is the intersection of the impairment limitations, change water limitations, the basin transfers, can you mitigate the impairment?
Never had that happen ever.
So that's the blocking, if you will, by the interpretations of the current water code, and you can find some other solutions.
The other is that whether it's agriculture or whether it's working with watershed improvement districts in the City of Linden, you can only take your ideas so far before you have to have buy-in from an agency or a group of, associations say, yes, we're willing to put our dime on the table, or we're willing to put our name on that letter to of your application for funding. Because if you don't have a buyer, if you would, we can't, you can take the horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Yeah. Climate change, I just quickly, why do we worry about climate change? For several reasons, but I've listed them there. The main thing I think is we could possibly have operational impacts on our diversion. Most likely, if we do, it would because of low flows. Those low flows are identified in the drought resiliency plan, as well as in different projects that we are completing, or not we, but that the Watershed Management Board and the Watershed Management Team are completing. I think that the greatest impact would be on low flows, but it could also, as we've seen in the last couple of years, impact salmon recovery. So why should we be worried about it? As long as we retain a place in the Watershed Management Board process on the 5-year work plan, working in support of salmon recovery as well as watershed planning, I think we need to keep an eye on climate change. Eventually, and I say eventually, in a future budget, I think we may want to consider doing another look at what the projections are on stream flow, heat, temperature, and then potential tidal influence. How high up the river will the sea level rise impact the ability for us to draw water out of for plant one. So I think that's all I have. I don't have anything else, and appreciate John and Rebecca's work on this, and hopefully it's been informative.
Thank you.
No, Actually, for me, I'd like to start with just thanking both Christine and O'Toole for agreeing to this workshop. But sitting down with Chris and then Steve and Rebecca and John getting involved and putting this together. I think this is, I don't know, Mr. and Mrs. Perry's here, and they spend a lot of time, a lot of the meetings and hear a lot of, they stand, talk, and nice, and I hope this presentation was an educational presentation and it was done well. Because if I remember, Chris, you want to put this to the point where others can view this if whenever they want to, maybe on our, is that?
Yeah, the purpose of this was, number one, to, kind of establish the curriculum. Then number two, make it available for new commissioners, new employees, customers who are interested. So it's just kind of a water 201, this, and then the next piece, which is going to be the operations of the utility. And just kind of provide an overview.
After having watched the last watershed board meeting with the Yakima people, it was interesting to hear John.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Mike, for instigating this and looking forward to the next presentation on operations. So no action today, just a workshop. I am going to close the meeting unless we have any other pressing matters. Okay, great. Well, thank you again to Steve and Rebecca and John. The meeting is closed.
Thanks, everyone.